Establish that change really is uncomfortable. We can all acknowledge that. We can all be honest about that. There's nothing wrong with that. Change is uncomfortable. But this week, before we launch back into the text, I want to remind you that change is also inevitable. Yes, it's comfortable, but it's also inevitable. When I was young, like when I was a teenager, I was just naive enough to believe it could never happen to me. And you might think, what could never happen to you? I thought I had never had a problem with weight, and I never will have a problem with weight. It just won't happen to me. Well, I hit 30, and all of a sudden I found that now if I look at a bag of cookies, I have to loosen up a belt loop. I mean, things just change. If you don't believe that change is inevitable, look at your own body. I want you to understand something today, though, before we launch into the text. Change is inevitable, but whether things change for the positive or the negative is really largely up to us when it comes to the church. You see, anything that is not changing for the positive is already changing for the negative. As a church, if we refuse to rise up and follow the will of God, the law of gravity will guarantee that we come down. Sometimes the change that people so vehemently fight against would have had major positive effects, not only on them, but on the kingdom. But because we resist, instead, the change that could have had positive effects when we resist it, it actually results in negative effects, things getting worse. So change is inevitable. Whether for the positive or the negative, change is inevitable. Therefore, we should be certain to embrace the positive before the negative embraces us. So how then should we prepare ourselves to deal with or to accept? We're talking about God-driven change in the church. Last week we offered one of 6 steps from the text on how to appropriately approach a transition. And we looked at the first step last week. We're not going to re-rehearse it today. I'll just give you the first step from last week. The first thing we said was that when you're facing change in the church, number one, ask questions about what God is doing. Remember, I tried to emphasize ask questions before making assumptions or making accusations. So before assuming that you know this is not God's will, ask to see if it is God's will. Before accusing those that are leading the change of leading in the wrong direction, hear them out and find out, have they prayed about this? Has God spoken into this? We're going to pick up with number 2 today. So number 1 was ask questions about what God is doing. Number 2, listen for God's answers. You know, it makes no sense to ask God questions if we're not willing to hear what God has to say. I think it's very unwise to ask God to speak if we're not willing, before He even speaks, to accept and obey what He has to say. I want you to look with me today at how Peter answered the Jews' accusations against him. Look at verse 4 of Acts 11. But Peter explained it to them in order from the beginning. Now, so Peter just simply starts to launch out and he says, this is exactly what happened. You know, the Spirit must have had control of Peter in this moment. Peter has always been brash. Peter's always been hot-tempered. And for him not to come back in anger, for him not to come back in hatred, the Holy Spirit has to be in this. Peter just simply responds, I was praying and this is what happened. Now, this is not really our message. This is really all focused. But I do want to say to you, who may one day be called to lead change, I want to remind you, a soft answer turns away wrath. Harsh words stir up anger, but a soft answer turns away wrath, Proverbs 15:1. If you're called by God to lead change and you get accused, and when you accuse, you return in anger, that anger, fueled by your own self-defense, fueled by your wounded pride, will never help you in the fight for change. So if you're called to lead change, remember, a soft answer turns away wrath. I think one of the greatest assets as leaders we have in leading change is just patience. Strategic patience. So here they've looked at Peter and they've basically said, you're not even part of us anymore. You've made this major change without consulting us. As far as we're concerned, Peter, you're just as unclean as a Gentile now. Peter could have got angry. Peter could have lashed back out. But having been changed by the Spirit himself, he doesn't fly off the handle. He simply and accurately recounts all that God has done. And he begins to say, look, one day I was in Joppa, I was praying, and the rest is history. If your leaders can come to you and say with honesty, before we made this change, we sought the face of God, and it was in prayer that we were led to make this change, you better pray about that change before you oppose it. The Jews didn't do that, so Peter explains. I was in Joppa, I was praying, God sent down the sheet 3 times. That led me going with 3 men to the house of Cornelius. God poured out His Spirit on Gentiles. We baptized them. That's the story. Verse 15. Peter says, and I began to speak. The Holy Spirit fell upon them as upon us at the beginning. Then I remembered the word of the Lord. How He had said, I remembered what Jesus said. He said, John indeed baptized with water, but you shall be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Peter is saying here, I remember Jesus said that believers would be baptized with the Spirit. Peter is saying, it became so evident to me in this moment that God was in this. Because only God can grant the gift of the Spirit. Verse 17, if therefore God gave them the same gift as He gave us, when we believed on the Lord Jesus Christ, who was I that I could withstand God? His response to his Jewish critics is basically, if God was in this, what did you want me to do? The word withstand actually means prevent, forbid, hinder. Peter's basically saying, do you really think it was my place or that I even had the ability to stop God from what He was determined to do? I think at this point, Peter's mouth was moving, but really it's God who is speaking here. God's letting these Jews know that He has welcomed those people into His church, even if they were not ready to welcome them into their church. So let me ask you this. What if change comes and you're so opposed to the change, you don't like the change hurts you, the change maybe even breaks your heart? What if change comes? What if God told you that He was the one that was behind it? Now, I made this plain last week. When I talk about change, I'm not talking about positional changes, not doctrinal changes. We're talking about practical changes. What if God made it clear to you that He was ultimately responsible for the transition taking place around you? What if God said, I'm the one doing this? How would you react? You know, we often say that we want God to speak, when in reality we only want Him to endorse what we've already decided. We've already decided this would be good for me, this would be good for my life, this would be good for my church, and we bring it before God and we want God to rubber stamp it. And our prayer is, God, please show us your will. But what we're actually doing is we're offering Him a document and saying, please stamp this with your approval. When it comes to change, be prepared. Because God's will is probably different than yours, and He'll probably, in His kindness and out of His love for you, He'll probably take those documents that you hand Him to rubber stamp, and He'll crumple them up and He'll throw them away, and you'll weep and you'll cry over it, and you'll say, I just can't believe the way things are going. But it's God's kindness that keeps us from getting what we want most of the time. Everyone wants God's will as long as it's just a vague idea. We can talk about God's will and everybody's like, yeah, I want God's will, because God's will is so vague. It's so ethereal. However, when God speaks and He speaks specifically, we're often not ready or willing to hear what He has to say. God's will is probably different than yours, and I think we should be very careful never to assume, please be very careful never to assume God's on my side in this. God is on nobody's side. God is on nobody's side. Our desire ought always to be not to get God on our side. Our desire ought to always be that we are sure, that we are certain that we are on His side. So, number two, really, in the midst of change, listen for the voice of God, and if God makes it plain, then He is in it. Don't resist it. Number three, rejoice in God's gifts. You see, God's always working. And God's working is a thing to celebrate, because God owes no one nothing but judgment. God doesn't owe you anything. He doesn't owe me anything. He owes us nothing but His wrath and His judgment. So when God shows any measure of mercy, it is an act of His stooping kindness. I think these Jewish believers here began to understand. After Peter responds to their accusation, they start to get it. They're so mad that these Gentiles they're so mad that Peter has gone into a Gentile's house that they're not even recognizing that God has saved people. But now that Peter has said, look, God has done this. God has given them the gift of the Spirit, the same gift He gave to us. Verse 18, when they heard these things, the things God had done, the grace God had shown, when they heard these things, they became silent. All of a sudden, this group of Jews were speechless because they can't combat what Peter said. This is obviously something that God has done. There are witnesses, 6 other witnesses there to say, yes, we saw it. The Gentiles received the Spirit. Now the Jews are speechless. It looks like maybe for a minute or two they just sit there. And they just, what does this mean? When they heard these things, they became silent. And I almost think the word eventually should be inserted in verse 18. And eventually they glorified God. There was a moment of silence where they were just processing this, where they were trying to figure this out, and then the light starts to come on for all of them. And see, that's one of the things that happens in change. There is a process of processing, a process of coming to terms with what's new, what you're not used to. But when they finally realize that God is in this, the first words they speak, it is they glorify God, saying, then God has also granted to the Gentiles repentance to life. When they do open their mouth again, it's not with accusation, it's with acclamation. Look at the goodness of God. You know, it's hard to hate what God's doing in other people's lives when you remember what God's done for you. The same God who granted salvation to the Jews had now granted it to the Gentiles. And now these Jews are realizing, who can be mad at the fact that God's showing mercy? I didn't get angry when He showed mercy to me, so why am I so angry now that He's showing mercy to other people? Even though this was contrary to the way they had expected things to happen, when it became clear to them that God was in on what was going on, they began to rejoice in the depths of God's mercies. In fact, God becomes bigger in their eyes because they see now that He is not just the God of the Jewish world. He's the God of Gentiles. He's the God of the whole world. You see, this change actually gives them a bigger vision of who God is. Everything God does among His people is a grant of His grace. And when you grasp that, even the change that God brings into the church, even the change that God brings into your life is an act of kindness towards you. When you grasp that, you'll be able not only just to embrace the change, but to celebrate it. Any change God makes is a good change, and it's for the good of the kingdom. And when you realize the goodness of God, and if God's good, His changes are good, then you can not only say okay to it, but you can rejoice in it because God is doing something amazing in the world, and in my life, and in my church. The fact that God is working in the world is a confirmation that things are not as hopeless as we thought they were. So even change, if it's led by God, is something to celebrate because God never makes a bad move. You know, I love to play checkers. I haven't beat Wayne yet, so y'all pray for him. Y'all pray that God will put it in his heart to lean God's direction on this. Haven't been able to beat Wayne, but if you watch somebody play checkers, you know, you'll be watching them play, and they'll make what looks like an absolutely terrible move. And you're thinking, why in the world did you do that? Well, they did that because they see the board in a way you don't. And that move that looks like a bad move is actually a setup for victory. Often when I play people, besides Wayne, when I play people, you know, I let them jump me and they feel like they have just cleared the board, right? They got one of mine. And then I'll go, pow, 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 pow. And you know, but that's the way God plays the game. Sometimes we look at the change and we think, God made a bad move. But what you don't realize is God is actually setting the whole board up for ultimate victory. Everything that God does is ultimately focused on the day He looks at His enemy and He says, King me. So when things are changing, instead of complaining, celebrate what God is doing on the board. Number 4, when things change in the church, encourage God's work. Look with me at verse 19. Now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. After Stephen's death, remember the Jewish believers in Jerusalem were scattered out. Some went to Phoenicia, some went to Cyprus, some went north to Antioch. When they got to Antioch, they preached the word, but they preached it to no one but the Jews only, verse 19 said, because that's all they knew. Verse 20 says, "But some of them were men from Cyprus and Cyrene. When they came to Antioch, they didn't know any better. When they came to Antioch, they spoke to the Hellenists, preaching the Lord Jesus." Now, the Hellenist has been used previously talking about Greek-speaking Jews. Here, the Hellenist is used talking about Greeks, talking about Gentiles. And the way we know he's talking about Gentiles here is because of the context. So they started preaching Jesus to the Hellenists, to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. And verse 21 says, "And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned to the Lord." So more Gentiles in Antioch start turning to Christ. Verse 22, "Then the news of these things came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent out Barnabas to go as far as Antioch." So the report comes back to the main mission base in Jerusalem, and they're hearing, okay, Gentiles are now not just being saved in Cornelius' hometown, Gentiles are being saved in Antioch as well. In fact, there's a multitude of Gentiles becoming believers. So when they heard about it, they sent Barnabas. "Barnabas, we want you to go investigate this. We want you to see if this is real. Is this legitimate? Is God really doing this?" Verse 23, when Barnabas came and had seen the grace of God. I love that phrase, when Barnabas saw the grace of God. When he arrived in Antioch and he saw that these people were genuinely converted, they were believers in Jesus Christ, they had been changed, they had received the gift of the Spirit. When that became so obvious to him, I love this idea, when Barnabas saw the grace of God. You know, when anybody becomes a believer and we watch their life change, you know what we're watching? We're watching the grace of God. Well, Barnabas comes into town and he sees with his own eyes the grace of God. And the Scripture says when he saw the grace of God, what? He was glad. And he encouraged them all with purpose of heart that they should continue with the Lord. For he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were added to the Lord. I think Barnabas really put point 3 into practice. When he arrived in Antioch and he saw the work of God going forward, he celebrated in what God was doing. And because he was cheered up, he cheered them on. Because he was excited about what God was doing in Antioch, he began to invest in what God was doing in Antioch. He encouraged them out of the encouragement that he received. Again, he is excited that God's at work. And rather than saying, well, why didn't God do this in Jerusalem? Or why didn't God do this in Bethlehem? Or why did God not do this in a Jewish city instead of in Antioch? Instead of saying that, he is so overwhelmed at seeing the grace of God. He invests himself in the grace that God is showing, and he begins encouraging the work of God. You know what I noticed about Barnabas here? Is Barnabas didn't say, well, I wish we could go back to the good old days when this was happening in Jerusalem. This is 7, 8, 9 years down the road since the great revival had took place in Jerusalem, since the outpouring of the Spirit had happened there. And it's been a long time since that's happened in Jerusalem. And Barnabas doesn't say, well, why won't God do this in Jerusalem? No, Barnabas sees what he is doing here. And Barnabas doesn't say, well, I wish we could go back to the good old days and the good old ways. No, Barnabas focuses on going forward and realizes that in going forward, he is actually entering into the good old days. You know, don't be discouraged when things change. I would encourage you, rather than being discouraged when things change, encourage the change. Because that change may lead to better days in front of the church than the days that are behind the church. Sometimes we think if things change, things are only going to get worse. But reality is, if God is leading the change, then that might mean there's better days ahead than behind if we embrace what God's doing. When you encounter change, I encourage you, encourage it. Be the one cheering it on rather than the one holding it back. Be one of the first people to say, if this is the way God's going, then I'm going this way too. Once you are certain that God is behind something, then do all you can to get behind it and move it forward. You know, when we're not able to accept God-led change, it really just shows in something about our own spiritual state. Spiritual people delight in being a part of what God's doing. You'll notice that one of the key things the text says about Barnabas here is that he was a good man full of the Holy Spirit and faith. His embrace, his encouragement of what God was doing on the outside was an evidence of what God had done for him on the inside. Because he is a man who is filled with the Spirit, he can recognize that the Spirit's at work. Because he is a man of faith, he has been enabled to support what God is doing rather than saying, I just don't know if this is really God. As a man of faith, he can see God working and he can embrace it, he can celebrate it, he can help it move forward because he believes God. You see, when the Spirit has control of you, then His will become something you delight in, not something that you have a grudge against. His Spirit's lordship is evidenced in Barnabas' actions, but his faith is also put on display. Think about this. What does embracing change have to do with faith? Embracing change demonstrates whether you really believe in the goodness, the wisdom, and the sovereignty of God or not. If God is good, if God is wise, and if God is sovereign, then the change He leads in time will produce fruit. When we reject change, we're not just rejecting what's being done, we are in essence rejecting the one doing it. You see, a fear of God-led change is just an outward display that we do not trust God to get it right. A fear of God-led change is really just an evidence that we don't have an accurate fear of God. Spiritual people follow God even if they don't have a detailed map of where His leading will end up. Spiritual people follow God even if it's contrary to the way they thought things should go. Spiritual people encourage change out of the encouragement they have received in Christ. Because Christ has changed me, now I want to see Him change the world. Barnabas saw what God was doing and he wanted to push it forward rather than hold it back. Therefore, he encouraged the work rather than exasperating it. Number 5, when change happens in the church, number 5, get involved where God leads. One thing I noticed about Barnabas here is it seems that he really understood his own capacity. I think Barnabas knew his giftings and he knew that he could not carry this work forward alone. He couldn't do it by himself. And none of us really are able. Now, change is something that God carries forward, but in our unique giftings, we have a part in it. None of us are able to carry the whole change on our own shoulders. Barnabas understands that. And so what he did, he enlisted someone to help. One of the greatest things you can do to move God-led change forward, the first thing you can do is embrace and celebrate the change yourself. But the second thing you can do is to get others in on it. To instead of complaining about it, to go to others and say, I think this is a great thing that God's doing, and I think we ought to support it. I think we ought to be part of it. Barnabas, though, realized he can't do all this himself. In verse 25, then Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul. Now, at this point, Saul's been out of the picture for several years, maybe as many as 7 or 8 years. But Barnabas has in his own mind, he remembers what God had said to Ananias about Paul. You remember in Acts 9:15, God had told Ananias that Paul is a chosen vessel of mine to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Barnabas knew that Paul was the right man for the next stage of the work. Therefore, he went, he searched diligently, he looked, he went through the streets in the city, he asked questions until he found Paul. And when he found Paul, he brought Paul back to serve with him in Antioch. I think Barnabas' role was not necessarily the one who was going to build the church. Barnabas' role was more like a contractor who sought the right man, who God had given the right skills, who could do what needed to be done. Barnabas wasn't the one that was going to build the church in Antioch. He was the one that would find the guy who would. So what he did, he went and he found Paul, he found Saul, and by carrying out his role, by bringing Saul back to Antioch, Barnabas set Saul up to carry out his role. And what I find so interesting in bringing Saul back to Antioch, Barnabas actually had a great impact on the kingdom, not just there in Antioch, but worldwide and for a millennia to come. Barnabas had a great impact because he enlisted somebody else. When God is leading change in the church, get involved where you can and then enlist other people to do what you can't. Number 6, finally, when God's leading change, seek to see God's bigger picture. You know, I don't know that we can ever really fully see all that God's doing at any moment. In fact, even when God does show us what He's doing, I guarantee you He's only showing us a part of what He's doing because our minds couldn't comprehend all that He's doing. And I'm not talking about all that He's doing in the world. I'm talking about all that He's doing in any single moment of our lives. So I don't know that we can ever fully see all that God is doing at any moment, but I think sometimes if we look at the way things are going, we can get glimpses of where things are going. If we look at the way, we can start to see the where. Look at verse 26. When Barnabas found Saul. When he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. Now, follow this with me. A couple paragraphs here. I want you to lay this out in your mind. When Barnabas brought Saul back to Antioch, he didn't know all that God was going to use Paul to do in the future. This one act of bringing Saul in began a movement that pressed the gospel out. Our obedience to God's leadership can have long-lasting effects on the eternal kingdom of God. And let me show you how. Notice, it's only after Paul and Barnabas have come back to Antioch, they have been discipling these new believers for a year. After a year of Paul and Barnabas teaching the truth to these new believers, the text says that they were first called Christians. The word Christian, we hold that as a maybe even a proud thing. We're a Christian. But when this term was placed on the church, it was a derogatory term. It was a term coined by unbelievers to mock the church. They were literally saying, "You bunch of little Jesus running around, you little Christ." They were, in essence, mocking these believers, calling them little Christ. Look, now let me tie this together. What I want you to notice here is that after a year of being discipled, after a year of solid teaching, the church was so much like Jesus that the world on the outside recognized it and marked them for it. The world began to call them little Christ, but only after Barnabas enlisted Saul, after Saul and Barnabas spent a year discipling the people and educating them in the doctrines of Scripture. It was after that chain of events that they were called Christians in a mocking way. Because they now look so much like Jesus. They're saying, look, there's little Christ running around everywhere. Now, the term of Christian to us has become a badge of honor. For all followers of Jesus around the world, we proudly wear the moniker now. Though it was a mockery then, we wear it proudly now. We are Christians. So what does that have to do with the bigger picture? You said, seek to see God's bigger picture. What does that have to do with the bigger picture? I want you to notice this. The church got its name not from a Jewish congregation in Jerusalem, but from a Gentile church in Antioch. The change God led to a new era of the church's existence that has marked the church ever since and will continue to mark the church until the end of time. We are called, get this, we are called Christians today because Barnabas embraced and encouraged change way back then. Your embracing the leading of God in change can actually affect not just this church, but the whole church, the body of Christ across the world for ages to come. So again, though we can never see all that God is doing, I encourage you, when God is leading change, try to see it not just for what it does to you right now. Try to see it for what it may mean for the future, not just what it does to the past. The classic argument for resisting change is always the same, though. The classic argument for resisting change is, but it's always been this way. Or, we've never done it that way before. Let me tell you something. The U.S. standard railroad gauge, that's the distance between the rails, is 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches. You know why that is? Why such an odd number? Why not 5 feet? Why not 6 feet? Why 4 feet, 8 inches, 8 1/2 inches? The reason that the railroads in America were built that way is because that's the way they built them in England. And American railroads were built by British expatriates, right? Well, okay, so our railroads are 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches. The rails are 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches wide because that's the way they did it in Britain. Well, why did the English do it that way? Well, because the people who built the pre-railroad trams used that gauge, 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches. They, in turn, were locked into that gauge because the people who built the tramways used the same standards, the same tools they had used to build wagons. So we build wagon wheels 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches wide, so we're going to build the trams 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches wide. Well, then you might say, well, why were wagons built 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches wide? Because with any other size, the wheels did not match the old wheel ruts on the roads. So we got to make the wagons the right width, or the wheels won't fit in the ruts that are already on the roads. So then you might think to yourself, well, who built these old rutted roads? The first long-distance highways in Europe were built by Imperial Rome for the benefits of their legions. And the roads that Rome built into Britain have been used ever since. The ruts of these roads on which they built the chariots, on which they built the trams, on which they built the railroads, the ruts in the roads were first made by Roman war chariots. 4 feet, how wide were the Roman war chariots? 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches was the width of a Roman war chariot. Why was a Roman war chariot 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches? Because that was the width of 2 horses' rear ends. Friends, listen to me. If we are not careful, our whole reasoning for why things shouldn't change may be as wide as 2 horses' rear ends. If we're not careful, our whole reasoning why things should not change may be about as wide as 2 horses' rear ends and as deep as a rut in the road. As I close today, I want to encourage you, God brings change because He loves people and He loves us. And sometimes the change that we encounter, that we struggle against, that change is not just about changing the environment around us, it's about changing the environment in us. Sometimes part of the reason God brings change, yes, there's things He's doing for other people, but there's something He's trying to do in you. And in your encounter of change, it causes things that need to change in you. Transition is often the necessary vehicle that God uses to take us to new levels of grace and faith. Think about that. I hate those. I can't think what they're called right now. Those carts that go up the mountain. You sit in them and it comes up and it comes right under you, and then you got to get off it. I hate those things. They make me so nervous. But when you think about it, if that's the only way to get to the top of the mountain, though it makes you nervous, if you want to see the top of the mountain, you got to go that way. And transition is like that. It's the necessary vehicle that God uses to take us to new levels of grace and faith. But I tell you, sometimes you're still going to be holding onto that rail the whole time on the way up, shaking, just let me get off this thing. Change is the chisel God uses to shape our hard hearts, our hardened exterior, and make us look more like Christ. If God makes it plain that change is His will, then I want to encourage you, embrace it as a gift given out of the pure goodness of God for your sanctification. So what do we do? And I put this in big bold letters in my own notes. What do we do when God changes His church? Ask questions about what He's doing. Listen for His answers. Rejoice in His good gifts. Encourage His work, get involved where He leads, and seek to see God's bigger picture. Let's be certain that we don't resist change, and our reason for resisting change is only as wide as 2 horses' rear ends and only as deep as an old Roman rut in the road. Will you pray with me? Lord,